ثبته بوشي هيك والطاولة عالية عرفت كيف؟ It's not comfortable. Okay. Okay.
Esteemed colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I extend to you a warm welcome on behalf of the Anis Makdisi Program in Literature at AUB. We are truly delighted and honored to have today with us Professor Damluji as a guest speaker. Professor Salma Samar Damluji holds the distinguished Muallim Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden Chair of Architecture in the Islamic World at the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. She is also a chief architect and founder of the Dawan Mud Brick Architecture Foundation in Yemen, which is dedicated to developing and working with vernacular and sustainable architecture. She is a recipient of the prestigious Global Award for Sustainable Architecture in 2012 and an active member of the Clinton Global Initiative in New York. She was also the director of the technical office of the chairman of the Works Department in Abu Dhabi and had working relations with the superstars in the world of architecture, such as Renzo Piano, Jean Nouvel, Herzog de Meuron. Professor Damluji also curated a number of prestigious exhibitions at the Royal College of Art in London, the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine in Paris, and acted as consultant to the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art. She's widely published over 13 books, including titles such as Zilige, The Art of Moroccan Ceramics, The Architecture of Oman, and The Architecture of the United Arab Emirates. And before joining AUB, she taught at various academic institutions, including the Royal College of Art, the AA School of Architecture in London, and lectured also at the BUC in Beirut, now known as LAU, and at the Lebanese University. Professor Damluji's talk is entitled The Other Architecture, a Sustainable Paradigm, Geometry, Vernacular Architecture, and Hassan Fathi. Its theme focuses on the creative thought that was instilled in Islamic and vernacular architecture in unmapped regional cities and towns. She will offer an overview of the understanding of geometric principles in architectural design, as well as consider Hassan Fathi's approach and research, also given the kind of first-hand experience she had in working with him during two periods, in 1975 and 76, and then in 1983-84. She will also reflect on a very fundamental issue now in terms of discussions at the theoretical level concerning sustainability in architecture, which focuses on the future of Earth architecture. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's rather intimidating to listen to this extensive list. I wish I had known, Nadir. I would have cut it in three lines, and anybody can go to the internet these days. It's a great privilege to be here, thank you, and in particular to be giving this talk at the Anis Makdisi Literature Program. And for this, I have to say there is a personal reason and there is a professional reason. The personal being is that I never forget the image of Anis Makdisi as a child, who cut a very elegant and aristocratic figure when he used to come and visit, and was very impressive, and he never said anything to us naughty children, at least not to our generation. And it's wonderful to be giving a lecture within a program named after him. This is my honor, to be honest with you. The other more professional and important issue is the fact that the literature program at AUB is recognizing the importance of inviting an architect. And I think this is a wonderful and an amazing step, because many architects think that they can be independent of both history, culture, and literature. And for this reason, I think part of my talk will be either based on this or will answer some of the qualms relating to this. I will show you a set of slides, but this talk, at Professor Bizri's request, is based on an almost retrospective of my work that was delivered in Paris last March. I was asked to give the leçon inaugurale at the École de Chaillot, based at the Cité d'Architecture et Patrimoine, and this was a very important lecture, delivered normally by distinguished architects, and the last two that preceded me at least were Jean Nouvel and Wang Shu. However, I was the first woman to have been invited to give that lecture, so that was something for me, of course. Apart from the fact that probably the only person from the south, but never mind, apart from Wang Chu from China, but never mind, let's not say an Arab from the Middle East. But, however, the leçons lasted 2 hours. However, today I will only cover sections of this because Nader very much wanted me to give a run of what I talked about. I will do this in 40 minutes. I will try and control it as much as possible. I might go over by 5 or 10, but not more. However, I was asked over that lecture to cover an extraordinary period of my working life. I say extraordinary because one hardly does so in one lecture. And probably after you heard what Nader told you, it's rather a feat to try and do that. After an introduction on my background and influences, which they requested, the talk was structured in 5 parts. Part 1 was on the geometry as a point of reference, which I will start with today. Part 2 was on Hassan Fathi, and Part 3 was on Yemen, the first period of my work in the Yemen, the first decade, if you like. And Part 4, which I'm emitting today from the lecture, was on an interlude in Abu Dhabi and on how the profession works with the alternative side of architecture, our side, the vernacular, the regional, the unidentified or unrecognized outside the norm of professional practice, or what I refer to as the other architecture. This is what I mean by the other architecture. The final part was on my return to Yemen since the 21st century, since the year 2001, and I worked there since 2005. I will just do a succinct rerun of the 4 parts, excluding Abu Dhabi, as I suggested. But it's very important to understand that as an architect, I have been concerned and engaged in unmapped towns and cities where I work with the architecture of complex depth and meaning, as opposed to following a specific wave or trend of an emerging, escalating type of practice that may be more appealing, publicized, established, etc. The decision to work with an unidentified or unqualified form of contemporary vernacular, this is why we call it the other, is associated with the cities, urban culture of our region, i.e. the East, a region architecturally branded as outside the accepted norm of modern Western practice. This is a difficult terrain to negotiate, but let alone sustain. However, this different route that has been equally novel and rewarding, providing a constant edge by virtue of the unfailing need, attraction, inspiration, and the knowledge it communicates and contains. It certainly was and has been for me, I believe, a paradigm of a higher order. The second section is essentially on exile and why I ended up working in cities outside my own country. But the important thing is to say that as an architect, the need to identify with one country, although terribly personal, became irrelevant, irrespective of how I might crave the time, places, and faces one retained of Baghdad, because I'm Iraqi, incidentally, and a legendary Iraq I come from, which cultivates an inner strength and establishes one's point of reference. And speaking of point of reference is where I found geometry. And when we speak of geometry, we're talking, in our case as architects, as an architect, I shouldn't speak in the plural, is concerning applied geometry, and applied geometry in building and in architecture. As far as I'm concerned, my main points of reference for quite a while has been the Grand Mosque of the Abbasid Samar and the Umayyad Cordoba. Both are unmatched pillars, ultimate works of architecture to contemplate as lesson of ingenious design in a school of thought that is absent in our architectural curricula. Extant here, of course, is the present force of architecture, one that continues to speak to us, hence the false premise of a general divide drawn in understanding the idea and concept of past and present. To be modern, you can hardly dismiss the dialectic still at work with former or earlier works of architecture. Hassan Fathi, spent the best part of his life in researching and recovering the design and knowledge still extant in the oeuvre of Islamic cities. His endeavor was to analyze, in turn, the functional and aesthetic components, proportion, and details, and bring these elements forth to the forefront of contemporary design and building. Crafts were an essential component in the making of the composition, and he stressed the role and contribution of the craftsman, in parallel to the master builders in the design and building process. It should not be imagined that as architects we are allowed the measure of freedom to operate and invent. We have one of the hardest and most frustrating métier when you dismiss or challenge the corporate status quo. Hassan Fathi died alone with 30 cats and, like Louis Khan, with no money. Their work suffered ruptures and failures, and we the same. And as Titus Burkhardt once said, we shall fight the battle until we lose. In establishing contemporary vernacular, there must be, which I'm going to talk about towards the end, there must be a continuous line of inquiry to accompany every project and investigation. Architecture provides this with generous terrain, synonymous with our search. We must work with it as tool for territorial development. Finally, I just need to add one point concerning history, heritage, and culture, which you will see in the end, because often people look at my work, and especially what I've been doing in Yemen over the last 10 or 15 years, and say, she's a restorer, she's an historian, she works in heritage, you know, all of which is true but untrue. I'm neither an historian nor am I a person who works in restoration, and heritage is heritage, like culture. So I have a lot of respect for working with and learning from an architectural and living culture as a creative discipline and resource. With regard to restoration as an architectural conservation, this to my mind translates as a métier identified with monumental structures. The tools, knowledge, and specifications that conservationists in the field work with are a technical resource and science that practicing architects are separated from or tend to ignore. This notwithstanding, the long-term value and benefits remain within the creative building and recovery process we are engaged in, and which is beyond the restricted conservation process. This explanation comes not so much to define what I do in architecture, but to also consider that cultural landmarks and restoration are not exclusive to historians and archaeologists. History or literature as heritage is, after all, knowledge that architects need to consult, research, refer to, and work more with. It's therefore important to establish, in the architecture and cities I've worked in, I've found that the line that is commonly drawn and forged between the past and the future is pure fiction, fictional. Thank you. Okay, so part one will deal with the geometry, and as you can see here, what I'm showing you are glimpses of these aspects. This is a detail of the Abbasid Palace in Baghdad, of the squinch in the Abbasid Palace in Baghdad, and the squinch is and stalactites are the transitory elements between a wall, in this case a soffit, the wall and the soffit of the arch or of the arch. These were very complex, and as you can see, this dates back to the 12th and 13th century, and it has been restored, but it was originally made in the same materials, and it's made out of fired lime, or what we call in Iraqi ajur or yajur, and carved. And another example is what I was referring to, Ariel. I was referring to Cordoba, which I'll show you in a bit, but this is one of the most sophisticated examples and prototypes, if you like, as opposed to examples, of what we mean by applied geometry and what we mean as geometry being a point of reference in architecture. I'm very wary of using the term Islamic architecture, but I think if I do, you will know exactly what I mean. In this case, we're looking at the Umayyad in Andalusia, and let us not forget that a lot of that followed very much the tradition that the Abbasids had established in Baghdad. And the Abbasids, to my mind at least, are trendsetters of a certain discipline, of a certain learning, not only in the literature and in the period of excellence and in terms of production, and that was concerning all the arts, whether we were talking about music, literature, philosophy, poetry, crafts, but because everybody was looking at the Abbasids finally to copy and imitate them, as you know, from architecture to cuisine. So the slide you saw previously was an interlace of the various elements and its geometry as at its most sophisticated. This shows a simpler version of how geometry is applied in two-dimensional form. And what I should say is part of my educational or architectural discipline or architectural education owes a lot of tribute to two men in my life who influenced my work and what I've done and how I've thought since then. These two were Keith Critchlow at the Architectural Association in London, who had in 1972 or 73 just established a book called Order in Space. And to a friend I met later and who was also terribly influential in the same discipline, and they were both working separately, who was Issam Saeed, the grandson of the late Nouri Saeed, who was the Prime Minister of Iraq in 1958. Both Issam and Keith were working on the geometric analysis, and what we mean by analysis is that they were looking at these patterns and working on the structure of constructing them, which until then was not very clear. A lot was mentioned in Ikhwan al-Safa, a lot had been mentioned in Al-Farabi, by Abu Hayyan and Ibn al-Haytham, and in various treaties that were taken and translated from both the Greek and the Neo-Platonism and the culture then, and they did a fantastic job out of this. Issam was one who was actually looking at all this work of Ibn Sina and Ikhwan al-Safa, and looking at how drawing the parallel in drawings, in the construction of geometry, between the descriptions of geometry applied to music in description, and geometry applied to poetry in description, and geometry applied to patterns or just applied, not to decoration. There was no such thing called decoration or pure ornament, in the sense that there was no literature which actually came and wrote down how this applied geometry was used in creating what we call today the arabesque or the Islamic patterns, right? But the systems exist. If you look at Ikhwan al-Safa, if you look at Ibn al-Haytham, and you go back to these sources, the drawings are terribly complex, and of course they are based on Plato, and you find them in al-Biruni. So literature was an extensively important factor that played this hidden role between the layers of knowledge that exist between the seen and the unseen, and what we call reality, or what we call the tangible and the intangible. And this is the dichotomy that rules much of the material that we are dealing with in architecture, in as far as architecture and geometry, applied geometry, is concerned. So what you're looking at here, being two-dimensional, is a drawing of this, is an analysis of this sophisticated pattern. The one on the left is the analysis by Issam Said. And the difference between Keith and Issam is that Issam worked on the concept of the unit, which repeats to infinity, and this is what arabesques are about, that unit would exist in simply within one circle. Once the unit is formulated or is configured, then its repetition would ensure the pattern. So if you look at, do we have a pointer here? Yeah, if I can manage this, yeah. So this is the construction, starts from here, simple construction based on the triangle, and then from there, you can see the hexagon built on the inverted triangle and the straight triangle, and then this also. Thank you very much. You're an angel.
Yes.
Thank you.
You have to press.
No. Thank you. And so, right. So I'm sorry about this, but do you want to see what you want to do with it? I can't be bothered at this moment. So if we look at this, this is the original construction. This drawing that you're looking at is actually around 5 or 6 drawings that was published in a book I edited of Issam's. After he passed away, he left his dissertation unfinished, and we just took one chapter of this dissertation, and Keith Critchlow and Tariq al-Bouri both worked on editing it, and I was the general editor of this book. And so it was, never mind. So what you see is that the grid, something wrong. Anyway, the grid is based on the 3 circles that you see running down the left, one on top of the other, and then originally you would see that the top one then creates the first unit that you can see in the red inverted kind of circumferences. This is what they are, that then repeat and create this amazing pattern that was incidentally used by Escher, and it was used by Paul Klee as well. If any of you know the drawing of Paul Klee with the birds running out that he did after his visit to Algiers. And so, so this is what the pattern that is based. There are 2 grids that we have, one based on the triangle and the other based on the square. And this is one of the simplest forms of the square that you can see in, or the grid up there, and then the pattern below, and you can see this better than the first one. I mean, it's simpler, and you can see these tiles, of course, in the Agra Taj Mahal pavement that was built for Mumtaz Mahal and then inaugurated 12 years after her death. This is the simplest form of geometry or applied geometry. And this is another triangle and hexagonal grid, or what is known as the 6-pointed star configuration, again in India and Agra, because of course we have some of the best remaining examples in terms of being well kept and being of a later period. And this is in the Maqbara, or the mausoleum of I'timad al-Dawla, also in Agra. And by the same token, you see the patterns, what is known in India as jali, and in Egypt they call the mashrabiya, although the mashrabiyyas are made of wood. These are made out of carved, literally hand-carved pieces of cut and hand-carved marble that are then create these perforated screens out of the same patterns. And you can rarely find the same pattern repeated in the same building more than once, except that it takes different forms. It takes two-dimensional and it takes three-dimensional forms. The three-dimensional you saw in some of the stalactites and the dome of the two sisters in the Comares Palace in Granada, and the other three-dimensional forms is the way buildings and facades were articulated. So we analyze buildings in the same way that we do in the two-dimensional drawings. And you do this simply by taking a plan or a facade and analyzing it. And Saeed gives examples of these, and I'll show you some. And again, as I was saying, Ibn Muqla, who was known as the Wazir, because he was a minister also in the Abbasid court, and he was also the innovator, or if we use in English, the creator, who created the 6 Naskhi styles. And he was a very important calligrapher, and of course had students like Ibn al-Bawwab, who later continued, but his treatise is one of the most important treatises. And he, in fact, I think, I might be wrong, was one of the few practitioners who was a calligrapher and who also managed to document. Because in reading recently the book of Professor Doris Abu Saif, which is a terribly accomplished book in terms of research, especially in terms of comparative literature, in terms of Islamic art and architecture, and she's brilliant at that. Her book, I think it was her first book, is called Beauty in Arabic Culture, talks about the different kind of, talks about beauty in various fields, whether we're talking in belles lettres, or we're talking in art, or we're talking in the visual. However, she notes at one point, and I disagree with her on another in the similar chapter, in the same chapter, she notes that none of that Al-Farabi, for example, when he did Kitab al-Musiqa al-Kabir, I think we all speak Arabic here, yes, including Cynthia. Yes. So when he did his compendium on music, was not a musician. And she says that a lot of these philosophers and authors of these amazing works who wrote about geometry were not craftsmen, were not practitioners. Yes? And she says this is why there's no mention whatsoever about the, not only there is no mention, that there is no influence at all in geometry on the actual buildings or the actual decorative pieces, and that the historians were separated from the craftsmen and the philosophers were separated from the craftsmen. This was her theory. Although she does at one point talk about how the philosopher and the intellectuals and the sages or the Sufis informed the patrons, and it was the patrons who actually were responsible for much of the architecture, and it still carries the name. But at the same time, she thought that there was a divide. I disagree completely here. And although Ibn Muqla might be one example, I'm sure there are many others of practitioners. And what Ibn Muqla did in calligraphy is exactly what we were talking about earlier in geometry, in the point and the circle, and using the circle as the main unit. And in this case, he pointed out that the alif, for example, of, let's say, muhaqqaq, is made up of a number of points. This is drawing by Keith Critchlow on the right-hand side. But Ibn Muqla talks about this, and he says it's equal to so many points, and that every part of every single letter of the Arabic alphabet is based on either the alif or on the circumference, diameter, or radius of the circle. So the Ra you can imagine easily, the Zayn you can imagine easily, Nun, etc. So what matters about all of this is that it's the same line of unifying geometry that was kind of a universal language and vocabulary that brought together all these arts that ran all across the region, and of course these were being previously Greek and used by the Babylonians, because we see them in the Ishtar Gate, we see them in Babylon, we see them in Sumer, we see them on various kings. We see the use of geometry continuously, especially the six-pointed star, which was associated with Venus. Of course, there's also cosmology. So all these points of reference just filter down and come across the Byzantine period, and from there come through to the Islamic after they, you know, and go back, and with the native or the Egyptian, Pharaonic, and then the Babylonian, Sumerian cultures come, and we see their development and evolution to a point which has been beyond nobody has managed to progress on this work since that period, since probably, I mean, of course, some work was done in the Ottoman period, but the most sophisticated work was kind of carried out and executed and implemented later in Central Asia and later in the Mughal India. And here you can see what we meant by the analysis of the plan of buildings. And the first one is one of the old examples of the 8th century in Baghdad, and the second one is in one of the Umayyad palaces, I believe, in Jordan. Now, by the same, in the same vein, as they say, and the reason why I was pointing to the mosque in Samarra was because of this incredible piece of architecture that has not been properly documented, I believe, except by some historians, by architectural historians. Robert Hillenbrand does a beautiful job when he writes about Islamic architecture, and probably one of the recent kind of updates on Creswell and Grabar, etc. And he has another attitude of writing which is also terribly liberal and beautifully entertaining and easy to read. Now, when Al-Mutawakkil built Samarra, the great mosque, he built with it this stupendous minaret that you're looking at, which we in Iraq call al-Malwiya, Malwiya meaning twisted, revolving. And this was built in the 9th century, 848, completed in 52. Luckily, as far as we know, it is still extant and has been for over a millennia. And its height rises to 53 meters. This was at the time one of the biggest mosques ever constructed, the Mosque of Samarra. It was the Friday Mosque, it was the Great Mosque. And of course, this also set the trend for Friday mosques, or what is known as the Masjid al-Jami'. And we just had remnants of the surrounding walls, and it was also one of the first examples of a minaret being constructed separate from the mosque and not directly attached to the mosque. And because the Abbasids were very keen on getting out from the Byzantine influence, as I mentioned a bit earlier, and what the Umayyads were doing, and they needed to create something completely innovative and different, they, of course, relied very much on the architecture of the country, of Iraq, and the neighboring Persia. And in that, we think that this is the Malwiya comes from the original design of the ziggurat, so it's got that same kind of format, and at the same time from the light towers that were used in Persia since fire and light was sacred there. The other wonderful thing about the Malwiya, before I forget, as children when we used to visit, they used to always tell us that the Khalif built it like that so that he could mount the Malwiya on horse and go all the way up and observe his kingdom, because Samarra became a capital in lieu of Baghdad after the Turkish troops were creating havoc in the city, and they moved them there. And this is Cordoba, another architectural feat, of course, both technologically and aesthetically. And this was built, first built by Abd al-Rahman in 785, and then continued to be expanded for up to 3 centuries. Imagine a building that continues to be built for 300 years, and this was one of them. And of course, one of the amazing factors about it, and then of course there are separate plans and studies that have been done which show the different periods and the different additions, and the addition of a maqsura and buying more land, etc., until in the end, when they come and construct the cathedral in the middle of the mosque. When we look at Ibn Tulun, another great mosque, and this is by comparison in a state that you can visit, but this is definitely, and as well documented by Hillenbrand, of Samarra influence and essentially Iraqi in essence. But Ibn Tulun anyway grew up, Ahmad ibn Tulun grew up in the courts in Baghdad with the Abbasids, so he does come from that culture anyway, and then he is appointed in Cairo, and he comes and he develops that system of construction. The dome and the fountain that you see in the middle are believed to date to the 13th century. However, it's interesting to note that whereas the Malwiya inspired Frank Lloyd Wright to do the Guggenheim in New York, and I think that's obvious if you look at the two, when you look at this little fountain here, which is very elegant, that inspired E.M. Pei to build the Doha Islamic Arts Museum, which is being applauded as one of the well-built, contemporary, etc. And the one on the right just shows the soffit from one of Ibn Tulun's, from the arches that you see in the back. The fountain is in the, it's not an ablutionary fountain, but it's it's like has a pool, and it's in the center of the courtyard. And then the soffit of this arch is one example of several of the arches that you see leading to the main prayer hall. Hassan Fathi lived in a very beautiful house in Darb al-Labbana in the citadel area of Cairo, and he had a stunning view overlooking the Sultan Hassan and Rifa'i Mosque and the citadel that you can see on the left there, which rises above in the distance the popular housing or low-cost housing building that you see in the foreground, which is at the entrance to his house. I have a small section here, it's a film, so let's see, it's just thanks to Lina Ghaibi.
Hassan Fathi, qui êtes-vous?
Je suis un architecte qui a perdu tout point de repère dans sa société arabe. Je suis un architecte arabe et qui a perdu tout point de repère dans sa société arabe, qui a perdu son arabité. Et je suis en train de me rechercher en architecture et en urbanisme. Retrouver, chercher et retrouver mon arabité perdue.
So I suppose it's clear and everybody understands what he's saying. Yes, we don't have an issue here with the French. So essentially what's important is that to remember when this was. This was in 1975. I was working with him on my year out from the Architectural Association. It's my 4th year, and some people came to do a film on Hassan Fathi, which was then directed and produced by Burhan Alaoui, and the film was called Il ne suffit pas que Dieu soit avec le pauvre, I think, peuple or pauvre, I can't remember. But one of the people working with him who wrote the script and is asking the question is Abdul Wahab Meddeb, who came and gave the lecture here in March or April, I can't remember. But this is the, what's important is that in 1974-75, all the architects and schools of architecture were looking towards the West, first and foremost. And nobody dared come and say that this is who I am. I am an Arab architect and I'm looking for my Arabité, my Arabness, however you want to, or my Urubiya, as they say in Arabic, and through these points of reference that are lost. And what was very important, these are incidentally two views of, can we go back? The dome on the left-hand side, extreme left, is that of the Sultan Hassan Mosque, which was one of Fathi's favorites, and I'll tell you why. And the here, this one, and this is a mausoleum. Hence, you find that the dome is central to the space. And this is the more recent. The one on the right is the more recent Rifai Mosque. Yes, and there's quite a huge difference in history between the two, but it's a beautiful vista, and the view is taken from his terrace and balcony, where he used to love taking people at sunset. Now, the reason why Hassan Fathi loved this mosque is he would take us all there, and he would look at the floor, and this was allegedly a much later pavement. Maybe Samir can enlighten us a bit later, but it's alleged that the pavement goes back to the 19th century, the marble courtyard, as opposed to the dating of the mosque, a madrasa, which is a mosque and madrasa, and it has a mausoleum, and it's got one of the most stunning and largest vaults, or it was documented by Al-Makdisi at the time as it being the largest vault in the world where the prayer area is, and was constructed in the 13th century, the building. So Hassan Fathi would take us there, and he would tell us, look at the floor, and you can see a central fountain there, and he would point at the madrasa pavement and say, this is town planning. And he was literally pointing at these. So if you understand the relationship between the grid and the geometry and the unit and the pattern, the two-dimensional that you're looking at, and the three-dimensional I was talking about, you will also understand the relationship between architecture and town planning working in the same dynamic as the geometry or applied geometry is operating between the unit and the structure of the pattern. He was an amazing man who was obsessed with two things, many things, but amongst them essentially two. The photo on the left shows him in one of his buildings, and beneath a vault constructed out of stone, because his obsession was with Islamic architecture, and not from an aesthetic viewpoint. Of course, he discussed the aesthetics and the proportion, like we all do, but we all said that the aesthetics and the proportion were based on the geometry and the craftsmen who were involved in the making of these elements of the architecture. But he was also more interested in the, what we call today, sustainable aspects of it, which meant the climatic, environmentally friendly, and adaptable items in architecture, elements of that Arab architecture, in this case of the Cairean house that you see. The one you saw before was of an entire wall constructed out of this mashrabiya screen. Yeah? And these, unlike what the Orientalists used to account of them being kind of screens for women to hide behind and to sing behind, and etc., and not to see and not to be seen. Of course, they served that purpose. But Hassan Fathi used to remind us that an opening always had three functions: to bring in light, and to bring in ventilation, and to bring in cooling. And this is what an architect should be engaged in. And this is what we're trying very hard today to establish within the identity of something we're calling sustainable, because it has been lost from a vocabulary that existed. So you can see some of these decrepit mashrabiyas here in Darb al-Ahmar in Old Cairo, and the one I showed you before. He also did studies and analyses of the ventilation and the way wind catchers operated. Of course, this has all become now very basic and very popular, and very few people kind of go back perhaps and make reference to him. But he was the first man who in the 70s was actually talking about this, discussing it and analyzing it and incorporating it in his buildings. This is in 1974 when I joined him, and Fayed Shukri is on the left-hand side. Fayed was both a client and an architect. The other thing which Hassan Bey was engaged in, when I arrived in 1974, he said, we're going to work together on writing a document for the design of mosque architecture, which to this day, incidentally, Arabs and architects in general don't know how to design. Every single new mosque that you enter, apart from the few built by Abdul Wahid Wakil or Rasim Badran, or those who understood the drill and worked more closely and were more cultured in terms of reading, etc., they all do mosques and put central domes inside, which is a completely erroneous and shouldn't ever be done. And in any case, so here was a note that he was writing me on how we should think about it. He was leaving the next day, and just skip. And this is a mosque that he had constructed in Gurna. The first obsession was Islamic architecture, ventilation, the crafts, building, the use of natural materials. The second one was the use of earth, both mud brick and stone in construction. And learning, he took the techniques from the Nubian master masons and applied these in the construction of the village of Gurna. And of course he used the techniques that were used with vault and dome construction in covering ceilings out of vaults and doing the domes, and using the same original and traditional spans, which are limited, or were limited, when one was using sun-dried mud brick and or stone, to 3.5 for the vault and 5 meters. And he always used as a reference the 4000 BC granaries of the Ramesseum, which existed in Luxor, that had these wonderful, huge vaults, and that of Ctesiphon outside Baghdad in Iraq, that was 27 feet wide. And he was a brilliant designer and a brilliant planner as well. Some of his projects were constructed, and this is one of his successful ones. And this is the village in the Kharga oasis in the central desert in Egypt. And he built the souk there, and it's called Bariz, by the way. This is the elevation and section of what is known as New Bariz. And this is the man who used to lecture occasionally, because he was living quite isolated in Darb al-Labbana, and completely, when I went to work with him from the 70s onwards at least, and after the failure of Gurna as a village, because none of the inhabitants who the government wanted to move from the old Gurna, because they were considered to be tomb robbers. You probably all know the story because there was a film done on it. And then move and to be kind of engaged in peasantry or in farming, inundated the town completely. However, he was an artist and a thinker, and these were some beautiful drawings that he illustrated of the houses he constructed, and concentrated on these houses after the 60s and 70s. After Gurna and Beriz, I think, there was one incident. He got very upset and decided to go in exile in the early 60s, and went and joined Doxiadis in Greece and worked with him. And they worked together in Iraq and did a lot of projects in constructing and building some towns there, including popular housing. And Hassan Fethi then started applying himself to the theories of acoustics, and wasn't very happy with what he had to do in terms of creating prototypes and repeating them in housing in Iraq. There was a housing in Sayyab, where the lake was. But however, he complied. And the plan on the right is of Sidi Krer in northern Egypt, near Alexandria, to the west of Alexandria. And this is where he had built a house for himself. And the one on the right, sorry, is the Fuad Riyad house, and the one on the left is the Sidi Krer house, which I'll show you in the photograph. Fuad Riyad's is in the pyramids. But he also built grand palaces. This is for Sheikh Nasser al-Sabbah in Kuwait, and he was responsible for the design, not so much for the implementation or the execution, which was done by one of the people who had worked with him in Oman, and his name is Omar al-Farouq. And these are the interiors of that palace. This is back to front plan, and this is of the Nasif Villa in Jeddah. This was another palace that he built, huge. He built a couple for the Nasif. I went back to work with Fethi in 1984, and essentially to help him edit his writings. He had written two stories. One was called Qissat al-Mashrabiyya, and the second was all about Orientalism, and the second one was called Utopia. And so I went back and worked with him then, but by then, he, as I said, since the 70s was completely alone, but he had built by then, in the period after I left him, between 75 and 84, he had constructed, or was in the process of constructing this house for Hassan Rashad, who's the uncle of Shahira Mehriz, whom some of you might know. And this was built in stone in the Delta region. And the other one was for the Andrioli family in Fayoum. He's Italian and she's Greek, friends of mine who built a house in Fayoum. And so, but there were 4 or 5 other ones that he constructed. And that's a view of the Andrioli house. Now, very quickly, because I don't think we have much time. We do? Yeah, 15? Okay. So I'll just go through Yemen, and I've added in a few photographs for the sake of those of you who have not been to Yemen. I thought it's only fair not to let you jump into the deep blue, because where I work in Yemen is in a region called Hadramaut. And so what I was just showing you was of Sana'a, the capital, that is mostly constructed out of baked bricks, out of stone and baked bricks. Looking at this map, I started working in Yemen when it was still separated as north and south. And in this case, when you look at the map, all the areas that are in this mustard or yellow color are the areas that I worked in and I did all my field work in. And this was all published in my most recent book on Yemen called The Architecture of Yemen from Yafa to Mahra, if any of you have seen it. And it covers this entire region. So when I started working, it used to be the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, otherwise known by the Brits as P-Dry. And P-Dry existed along the borders that you see where all the yellow stuff is with Mahra, which is on the border of Oman, including that area which is called Lawdar Abyan. The reason why it's not included in my book is that there's no significant architecture there. This is where most of the tribes are based, and most of the warring tribes. They were the real warriors. I mean, the army was always made of guys from Lawdar, the minister of or Abyan. And now, if you hear the news, all the problems in the south are the most ferocious people, most ferocious fighters are the Abyan people, although the Dala guys haven't been doing badly either, but that's another story, unfortunately. The northern part is where Sana'a was, and of course, as you well know, or might not, since 1990, the two countries have been united in one. I've put in these two samples because these are quite important. The building on the right was constructed, can you see? Was constructed in 2001 or 2002, and it was built completely out of stone, and it goes up to 6 and 7 stories high. And it exists in an area called Yafa, which I went to visit in the late 70s. When I went to visit Yafa, no foreigner had been. The Brits had never dared to go there because the Yafa'is were rather ferocious, and they didn't allow any occupiers to come. Of course, no Ottoman, no Northerners, no. And to this day, they're very difficult to man. Although, unfortunately, after the country united, their women now completely cover in black from top to, from head to toe. But what matters is that this architecture that you can see on the left-hand side there, and you can see a faded section of in the slide on the right-hand side, these are buildings that are constructed entirely out of stone, ceilings, walls, floors, the whole works out of sheer stone. There's nothing used there, and when wood is used, it's used as you can see here, beams between the separating the stone ceiling or the stone pavement or the stone slabs that are covering the ceilings. This is the house of a builder called Bin Mas'ad, who was helping me when I was working there. And the plan repeats, the same plan repeats all through the house. And that's just very quickly to show what we meant by the entire construction in stone, that what looks like lintels are made out of stone. And this was being constructed in the in Shabwa in kind of late 80s when I went to visit, late 80s, yeah, 87 or somewhere along there. And the walls are interestingly built in two skins, an outer and an inner skin. The outer skin is called Zahara, and the inner skin is called Batana, which I always say reminds me of this, the Batin and the Zahir that is used in literature, you know, on the two sides, and it's very interesting. And in between, of course, is an infill of rubble and some chips of mud brick. And these are some prints I had done in black and white of Bayhan, just to say that the amazing architecture of Yemen is not only in Sana'a and in Hadramaut. And this is the area that kind of is the transition of sun-dried mud brick architecture in terms of clusters, in terms of towns, complete towns and cities. And this was actually in Ataq before Bayhan, in the area called Shabwa. And this shows the prototype in 3 models I had done for an exhibition in London for the launch of my book in 2007, of the different types that exist in the tower houses, whether they are basically the Highland house, or in the case of the Habban Alewa house in the center, which is constructed out of sun-dried mud brick. You can see it was inside the city, which was a central city in Shabwa. in Habban, sorry, that one. And the one on the right is built out of shale. So these are models of 3 different high-rises constructed out of 3 different materials. Stone on the left, you saw in the Bin Mis'ad house in Al Bin Salah, sun-dried mud brick in the center, and shale, which is known in Yemeni as girf. And these are almost calcified slabs of mud that are found in quarry just above where they quarry lime. So it's a very ancient, geologically ancient type of stone that is used in construction. And when you see the building from the exterior, you think it's mud brick. Next. I'll show you some samples later. This is the area I've been working in since 2006 in Doan. And you can see the intense kind of dense juxtaposition of all these cities and towns, which you see all pointed out in this area here. Yeah, that area there. And on top, on top here, you see the proper Wadi Hadramaut proper, or what is known as Wadi Hadramaut, and this has the main central cities of Shibam, Tarim, and Sayoun. So this is Girf, as I showed you a bit earlier. The one on the right is a very old example. It's a very old building, and this photograph was taken in an area called Wadi Hajar, which is in the coastal side of Wadi Hadramaut. And you can see that it probably looks like either stone or mud brick for you, but this is a very crude way of construction. It's been much more developed now in its use. But you can see a close view of Girf on the lower right-hand side. Thank you there, yeah. And on top of that you see stone, and above it another set of Girf with mud brick in between. The one below is dry packing, and the one on the right, on the one on top is with mortar using. And these were just examples used in a house, and I thought it interesting to show the different types of material. I took the photograph, and the one on the left shows a building a wall constructed out of Girf, but using lime mortar, mud mortar, and a lime mortar. This is Mukalla, which used to be a very beautiful town and has been completely damaged and ruined, unfortunately, as you can see from this hideous-looking mosque in the center. In the center there, yeah, the old mosque. There's this fashion of destroying traditional historic mosques and building these new hideous ones that they kind of download from anywhere in the Saudi Arabian catalog. So this is what we get. However, all of the buildings there in Mukalla were constructed out of stone and covered with mortar. The woodwork that you see here is very elaborate, and it was done by the craftsmen from Doan, the area I'm working in. Just some quick views of Mukalla to show you the interior. But more importantly is, yeah, thank you, is this building that has been published everywhere from Freya Stark to Thesiger. And incidentally, Thesiger, before he died, had this photograph, not just before he died, by 5 or 6 years, moved to a home outside London. And he took with him very few things because he was living in a room, one room only in this home. And he had a photograph in black and white that he had taken of the Sayoun Palace on his first visit there. And this building, I'm continually being asked and told whether this is the biggest building in the world constructed out of mud brick. But since really I'm not a person who subscribes to any of this Guinness World Book of Records, especially after you live in the Gulf for a while, you realize what they're talking about. I used to think it's a joke, this Guinness World Book of Records, until I went to the Gulf. Anyway, however, I'm not certain, I'm not sure, and I haven't looked into it. But as you can read, it's a total area of nearly 6,000 square meters, and it's 34 meters high. It used to be the Kathiri Palace in Sayoun. And Sayoun is the central town, which is the capital of Wadi Hadramaut, and not the capital of the coast, which is Mukalla. Because Hadramaut, as you could see from the map, is the largest and biggest province in Yemen. I just slipped in one plan of this building so that you can come to terms and look and see kind of how this building is on the inside as opposed to the outside. Now, if we want to speak about the function and the kind of climatic aspects related to why this building is more important than any of the modern buildings that are being constructed, is of course for many reasons. First, in the layout of the plan, you can see that the external walls, this is a palace, so I mean, whether it's a palace or it's a house, the same rules apply. The walls on the exterior have to all be load-bearing walls, and they are all thick, and they're all from 80 centimeters to 120. So sometimes the walls are 1.20 meters, sometimes 1.40 meters, depending on what is required. In the case of this being a palace, and you're looking at the ground floor, and most of the walls here are load-bearing, of course you will see that the thickness in the drawing looks the same. One of the reasons for this is this drawing was done by somebody at Sayoun Palace, who very proudly did this digitally on a computer. But had it been done by hand, you would have been able to see the differences between the external and internal. These thick walls, of course, are very important in terms of preserving the heat, and being mud brick is always a slow conductor of heat. And this is one of the things that Fathi used to talk about as well, not just talking about form and appearance. And then the plan is very interesting, because you look and you see that there are these 4 towers which are slightly post-colonial type of architecture that must have been added on, and then the almost squared plan that you see there. And then you see that we have essentially 4 rooms, and the larger the rooms are, the more columns we have in order to support the ceilings, because wood was used for the ceilings, and 3 different staircases to arrive to the building. It's one of the most beautiful buildings, actually, on the interior in Hadramaut. Let's look at the material. In Yemen, I consider Yemen very important for a very simple reason. It is the most sophisticated building in terms of both construction and in terms of design of the architecture. And only if you look at the ingredients or in the catalog of types of mud bricks, forms and types of bricks that are used to construct with, will you understand why it is so sophisticated and how this tradition has been going on for years. Builders in Yemen are always known, the Hadramis in Arabic are called Hadarim, and the Hadarim in Yemen are quite well known all over the country for being the best builders and the best Noura producers. And Noura is the lime, is the live lime that is used to create the plaster, what you call plaster, or what appears to be like whitewash, but is much more, and it's so refined to the point that when applied, it's applied in 4 or 5 coats. When it's applied, it becomes very marbleized in texture. And so fields upon fields that you see like this naturally for mixing and making mud. And then the pieces, if you look at them, the large pieces for constructing the ground floor walls, because every wall in the building takes a special type of brick. And in this case, this brick is called al-mudir or abadi. It's called al-mudir because it does the idarat al-haraka, if you like, of the entire affair. And it is the mudir because it controls and it directs the rest of the building. If you, as a builder, are successful in constructing the outer wall, you then graduate into becoming a level above the assistant. And there's a slight, yeah, this is the Noura being, after it was treated, burnt, the jir, the limestone, having burnt for several hours. And this is a view of the fabulous perennial shibam, which we recently completed a project there but haven't finished. This and Sana'a are on the World Heritage List. Shibam is constructed out of sun-dried mud brick. And of course, there's a tremendous catalogue of domes. I'm just going to very quickly show you one project that we completed, one of the most recent projects that we completed, I think. Unless there's a few, and then I'll just skip them. But this is Hajarain. This, for those of you who know Imru al-Qais of Kinda, is where he comes from. So he comes from an area close to this, and so it's literally in the vicinity of Damoun that he speaks of in one of his poems. Hajarain is at the mouth of Wadi Do'an, and I'll just very quickly show you. This is a palace that belongs, two palaces that belong to the Bukshan family. And there's a section here showing the building, which was constructed in 1954, and the plans of this house that has 45 rooms. And every single room, incidentally, has a bathroom en suite, because this is how they build in Do'an. They've been building like this since the early part of the 20th century, way before anybody else was. A bathroom inside with accompanying bedroom, and a system they call the apartment. In 2005, 2006, I went back in 2005 after an interruption of 5 years, when I was in, or maybe more, when I was in Abu Dhabi, and then I went back and I set up this foundation called Do'an Mud Brick Foundation, related to Do'an. And one of the first sites was this area called Masna'a Toura. I'm just going to take you very quickly. I think it's all self-explanatory. A section of this building collapsed. You can see we do a lot of survey, and this is part of what we call design research. We do a lot of surveys, then we have to work on getting the money, and once we work on getting the money and finding a client, in which case we did, we then go in and start, with whatever little we have, we start working. And this shows the reconstruction of one of the houses that had collapsed after the floods. And you can see that as soon as a building, the red areas show sections also that have been reconstructed. And as soon as these buildings are reconstructed, these are situations, the previous one was a situation showing the reinforcement of these buildings using stone pillars that are actually dug inside cavities in the load-bearing walls to add more support. And the minute you start restoring these buildings, they look completely renovated and new. You can go on. This is a beautiful site that was taken over by a client, Yemeni Saudi of origin, and he wants to turn it into a heritage hotel. And we managed to restore this building, one of the buildings, completely on the inside and outside, which is this one that you see here. And you can see the precarious kind of length that the builders go to in suspending themselves over the cliff, and forget about health and safety or boots and helmets. I mean, they wouldn't hear of it. And this is what the buildings look after reconstruction. And this is a view of Masna'a being half restored now, and a view from the back. Go on. And this is one of the mosques that I found, which I restored with the help of the Prince Claus Fund, who was amazing in supporting us a lot with the work in Yemen. And this is one of the oldest mosques in an area called Sah, or Wadi Sah, in Wadi Hadramaut. And we managed to redo the. You can see here on the left, for example, the one on the right is the dome as it was before. And what we do is we completely strip this, and then we put new mortar. And this is like the third coat of mud mortar before we apply the Noura. And then you see what it looks like new. We also reconstructed, built from scratch, these 4 tombs of the awliya. They have a lot of Sufi awliya in Hadramaut, and they use them. And in Aynat, we worked on this mosque and renovated it. It's again one of the first, if not the first mosque actually, which belonged to presumably the father of the Alawites, who came to, not Alawites as in Syria, these are Alawites who came to propagate Sunnism and fight Ibadism, because they were Ibadis in Yemen as they are in Oman today. And this is the final project I'm showing, which is called Husn. It's called Garn Majid, forgive me. It's a Husn, which means that this is the state of the building before we got to it, and it was in danger of collapse. Again, we got assistance from, this is me and the owner on the right and the builder on the left, and this was a year ago before we had started. And we started, and we just recently completed the building. And in fact, you can see here on the left, the guys in the scaffolding, and on the right as well. And the interior. We do the exterior first, and then we come and we work on the interior. So this architecture is still very much alive, and it's very much a contemporary architecture, as opposed to it being one that people consider archaic or retrogressive or of past or, you know, kind of impoverished. And this is what the building was looking like. And the guys, the team, you saw on the photograph on the balcony. And this is a 3-dimensional drawing which a colleague, architect Hamad Hamawi's office did for us. And they did a series of beautiful drawings for us, which was really nice. And this is the final touches put on the building, which I believe Nader used on the poster. So I thank you very much for your patience. And sorry for... Can I just end with, can you see the next one? Just end with this quotation that I ended my lecture in Paris with. It's a quote from Ibn Arabi, where he says, I'm giving you my translation, that places, al-amkina, have an influence on subtle hearts, على القلوب اللطيفة. إن للأمكنة تأثير, don't forget my grammar, تأثير على القلوب, bravo, yeah, if we can see it. فكما تتفاضل المنازل الروحانية كذلك تتفاضل المنازل الجسمانية. And then he says, ففرق كثير بين مدينة يكون أكثر عمارتها الشهوات وبين مدينة يكون أكثر عمارتها الآيات البينات. And I leave the English. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very rich
Sorry
lecture.
for going on forever.
We're going to open it now for questions and comments. I think if you perhaps take the questions and comments
Yeah,
rather than
sure.
reacting as a member.
No problem.
Shall we turn on
I'm
the
sorry
lights?
that with the extent of the material, because I did want to show, you see, what happens normally is when you show one section of your work and you don't show the other, you get kind of stigmatized. So people at AUB don't know my work at all, and I have been attached so strongly to my work in Yemen that very few people know anything about my background, and so I thought it was quite convenient to use some of the sections from the lecture which Nader had asked me to give from the lesson. But at the same time, of course, there's a huge problem, which is that the amount of material I have on Yemen is so vast, and so is the amount on everything else. and that where I might have succeeded in cutting down the first two sections on Hassan Fathi and geometry, I didn't when it came to Yemen, because I felt it just gets completely disfigured if I move straight into Hadramaut and just talk about the last two projects. But there are many aspects, of course, that were not covered, technologically, functionally, vernacularly, functionally, whatever. So please, if you have any questions. Yeah.
The big palace. How did you manage to have an internal courtyard?
Yeah, sorry. One of the pictures showed of the interior courtyard with the galleries overlooking. So if you remember the plan, there's a big courtyard in the middle. Yeah, and then the rooms are surrounding it. And the biggest rooms that they call Fadila are on the corners. And then they have rooms. But every room you saw squares. And then you have a bathroom, and you've got a dressing room, and you've got a bedroom. And 2 floors have been turned into a guest house or a hotel. But unfortunately, there are no tourists in Yemen these days. So.
I'd like you, Samar, to link the geometry, like the first lecture with the Yemeni architecture in the last part. And to talk a little bit about the relationship, if master builders in Yemen, you feel, are using the geometries explicitly?
No, there's a big difference between what we call vernacular architecture and the formal, what is known as Islamic, whether it's Abbasid, Umayyad, or state architecture that is formal, which was constructed in such a way that was sophisticated. And this difference is also found, of course, in Ibn Khaldun when he talks about the difference between urban and societies that are less urban. I don't want to say Badu. In the same way that you find that Al-Hadar, for example, were associated, and they are the urban, were always associated with bricks. So for the longest time, it's very interesting that we find that when referring to the Hadar, Hadar are identified by the Iraqi historian Jawad Ali, I believe he was called, who says that Ahl al-Hadar are Ahl al-Madar. So the people of the bricks are the people of the urban people as well. However, when we come to vernacular architecture that you find in southern Yemen, that you find in less formal types of architecture, and that's what we mean by most of the vernacular, you find that whereas these adhered very strongly to environmental, climatic, and sustainable, because all of these also serve defense purposes, they were not as sophisticated or as complex in having that same patron, craftsman type of relationship informed by the intellectual or by the Sufi sage or by literature. So yes, you find that there is a mosque in Shibam that was built during the Abbasid period, and that mosque was known as the Mosque of Harun al-Rashid, and it was alleged to be the only building constructed in sun-dried mud brick, but that's where it ends. So when you go to the interiors of the mosques, you find that they use the correct discipline, and that the decoration is more, there's no such thing as decoration, it's much more minimalist, and that it's much more in the three-dimensional, it's applied in the three-dimensional as opposed to the two-dimensional. This is in terms of the, where they carry the use of some of the geometry. But it's less explicit. When you go to a building like the one that Salma Radi was working on in Rada, and why you've got these exceptional geometry and murals that exist in Rada, in Al-Amiriya school, it's also because it was quite influenced, as you might know, from the Indian Mughal culture. Not that it didn't exist in Yemen, it did exist in several palaces, and we see it in many of the painted ceilings. But these also came from external influences. So I don't think there's a direct correlation between the two, except that they work together and hand in hand. It's like speaking of Nubian Upper Egypt with Cairo, for example. Sorry.
Thank you, Salma. I have two questions. First, I didn't understand why you distanciate yourself from, say, they said this is heritage. I mean, you want to associate yourself with heritage and functionality at the same time?
No.
Is it a house way of, I mean, I didn't understand this point, and maybe in relation to this, you didn't talk about Hassan Fathy, where he wanted a sheep architecture for poor.
For the poor,
So there is an economical dimension. You
Sure.
didn't talk about it because I'm afraid
Sure.
that sustainability, I mean, the way you show, maybe it is
yeah, possibly. It might have been misunderstood. You see, the problem is when you know somebody so well and you lived and you worked with him and you're currently writing a book on him, you tend to want, I mean, I would have preferred not to talk about Fathy at all, to be honest with you, but I haven't talked about him for such a long time. So you forget the essential point. Of course, he is associated with housing the poor, yes? And he was supposed to be the architect of the poor. But we also know for a long time that after the failure of many of the key projects in his life, which essentially were gurna, that he wanted to work because he had worked on all the social and economic aspects that existed in that project and in making it work. If anybody's read Architecture for the Poor, you will see all these. However, what happened is that we talk less about this, which I did, and it's probably because I took it for granted that everybody knows this. And in fact, there are many people who come and say, this architect for the poor has only succeeded in building for the rich, okay? And this was something that came out in the 70s, it's not recent. By the same token, that the best disciple he has, who is Abdulwahid al-Wakil, if you've heard of him, he's an architect who lived in Saudi Arabia and is currently, I don't know where, Qatar, London, and Paris. For example, Abdulwahid is associated with construction. You see, it became into a cause because when we were young in the 70s and we were working as architects because we wanted to change the world, and this was the revolution for us was going to happen through architecture, it was very important to establish all these points, whether it was Islamic, vernacular, heritage. They didn't used to use the word heritage then, yeah? Except UNESCO, I think, was Islamic and vernacular, Arab, establishing the Arab, and of course building for the poor. Who else? We don't want to build for the rich, do we? But if you see that of course the successful projects in the end were the small private projects that were funded by people, because every architect needs a patron. An architect cannot function without a patron. This is why you find contractors ruling the world now, because they're the ones who are running the show. And very few architects are allowed to work except in private projects. When it comes to public, you're in deep water there. And in his case, he was very fortunate that he had the chance to work on 3 big public housing projects, one which in the minds of people and the critics and the architects has failed. I personally don't think so, for other reasons. It's enough that the kind of lessons and what he showed us can be done in architecture, and how you can modernize the use of earth, sun-dried earth, that was for the longest time associated with takhalluf and to build better houses for the poor. So that in the end, he said, you know, when Sadat came and asked him to do his istiraha in Aswan or something, the guest house, he said, look, when a prince comes and asks me to build his house, because Prince Aga Khan, who had the flat below him, also asked, I become the prince. And when I'm building for the peasant, I become the peasant. So there was never for him that distinction. But unfortunately, the good projects that survive are the ones that were funded. So yes, you have a huge point, and his heart went out and bled, and that has been extremely well documented in his book, Architecture for the Poor. When it comes to the confusion I caused in discussing heritage, is because outside, abroad, a lot of the people think, because I can speak a bit, or quote somebody like historians, or talk about the Abbasids, or talk about the Umayyad, or talk about the Babylonians and the influences, they tend to think I'm an historian. So I get introduced half the time as an architect and an historian. And it's very difficult to distinguish. The other issue is that many modern and young architects now, especially in this part of the world, take the idea of rebuilding, reconstructing, repairing and recovering a lot of the wealth of the architecture that we have at our hands in Yemen. I mean, look, you can never reinvent a building. You can imitate as much as you like, but imitating is a very difficult business. And it's very hard. I mean, it's easy to copy, but it's very difficult to imitate well. We know that. And reinventing is hard. It's hard to reinvent. It's hard to reinvent the Umayyad Mosque, even if you had the same stuff. It's hard to reinvent all these excellent pieces of architecture, and the same is true of the architecture. We can build completely modern, beautiful stuff that is based and emulates and takes into account all these points I was discussing. I never suggested that we should go back and build in this way. I don't believe it either, you know. And this is where people find it strange. I mean, shouldn't we just be... No, you might build beautiful stuff in cement and concrete if this is the material you wish to choose and you wish to live with artificial cooling. But talking about sustainable architecture in the long term, heritage is very important. But I don't like the looseness of the term heritage. I don't like the looseness associated that some architects or architectural circles associate history or archaeology with architecture. As if, you know, you're either an archaeologist or you're an architect. But you cannot have a dialogue or discuss, and you cannot... I mean, the West understands this, or Western discipline and education understand, but still, in architectural schools and disciplines, it's not easy to bridge across. So it's very important to say, hang on a second, I don't work with UNESCO writing reports. I'm not strictly a heritage person. I'm no historian, and I won't be, except if it were in a second life, and I hope I won't be an historian in second life. I have other things I'd like to do. Yeah? However, we are architects. But and that's what I meant. Sorry, to go on. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you, Nadia.